in the steering committee of IRPI, and I'm a visiting professor in Pará of Belém, Belém of Pará in the Brazilian Amazon. And we'd like to kick off a new IRPI webinar series. It's a platform to further discussion on issues of contemporary political economics within and beyond academia. Our very first webinar today will be presenting a presentation by Professor Helen Yaffe, who will talk about her research on Cuban development and the critical situation in Cuba after recent horrific imperialist attacks on the government. The webinars will be hosted over Zoom and streamed on YouTube. European members are encouraged to join via Zoom and participate in question and answers. Helen will be talking for roughly 50 minutes, and then we'll have at least a half hour of questions and answers. And we ask people to contribute for suggestions, possibly for future webinars. There'll be two types of webinars, both one's generally about political economy, but we're also going to push for the opportunity for young scholars to make presentations and obtain feedback. So keep your eyes and ears open about upcoming webinars based on the website or the listserv. So we are pleased to have Helen Yaffe, who's a professor of Latin American political economy at the University of Glasgow, specializing in Cuban development. Since 1995, she spent time living and researching in Cuba. She's the author of book Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution in 2009. And she has also written We Are Cuba, How Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World from 2020. She's also co-produced 3 documentaries, Cuba and COVID-19, Public Health, Science, and Solidarity in 2020, Cuba's Life Task, Combating Climate Change in 2021, and thirdly, Cuban Bees, The Organic Revolution, 2023. She's also a co-host of Cuba Analysis podcast, which was launched last autumn, and she's often interviewed by and contributes to mainstream media in addition to progressive media. So in today's webinar, she'll be presenting the research from her most recent book, We Are Cuba, as well as an assessment of the ongoing situation in Cuba. So without any further ado, I will pass the virtual microphone to Helen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. And thank you, Paul, for inviting me, and for Al Campbell for passing the buck to me when there was the idea of a webinar on Cuba. So I've been told that you'll, between you, have kind of different levels of knowledge about Cuba. So I'm going to try and explain things, although I know that some of you will know a lot and will be more interested in the sort of debates about the role of the law of value in socialist transition and so on. But that's not where we're focusing so much today. We're going to talk about the research that's kind of in my second book, We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World. This was written, by the way, prior to COVID and prior to, or just that it was, you know, I had to add a final chapter as the Trump administration of 2017 had started really ramping up more sanctions against Cuba. And then the question became, as it is today, will Cuba survive the Trump administration? So I'm going to start by sharing my slides. Here we go. That should be it. Can you see that? Let me make it full screen.
It's
we
open.
can see it. It's not full screen yet.
Is that full screen?
No.
Oh, what about that?
Yes.
Now it is.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so that's me. Those are the title of my books, and I'd encourage you all to check out Cuba Analysis podcast, which we launched. I launched with a team of other people in autumn last year, and it's on Spotify and Apple and YouTube and social media as well. So I'm just going to start by saying something about my engagement with Cuba. I first lived in Cuba as a teenager with my big sister in 1995, 96. So those of you who know about Cuba's, timings and periodization will know that that was almost the worst moment during what's known as a special period. It was a special period in time of peace, was the full title, and it was the economic crisis that happened after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. So this is the period when GDP plummets by nearly 35%, and there is scarcity of absolutely everything. And I'll talk a bit more about the Soviet bloc. So I went with my big sister to find out about socialism for ourselves in Cuba's most acute period of economic crisis in the 1990s. But I was absolutely captivated, which is what happens to most people when they go to Cuba. And I continued to return to Cuba for solidarity brigades. So I should say I've been involved in active solidarity, campaigning for international festivals, research and events. I did my doctoral research at the London School of Economics, but of course all of my primary research was in Cuba at the Che Guevara Study Center, where I had access to things like the internal transcripts of the Ministry of Industries, which Che headed, documents that had barely been seen by anyone, interviews with people who had never given interviews before, who worked very closely with Che Guevara, not as a guerrilla fighter, not on his trips around Latin America, but as a member of the Cuban government. So he was the president of the National Bank for a brief period, then Minister of Industries, prior to that head of the Department of Industrialization. He was also on the Economic Commission and the central of the party and the Central Planning Board of the government. So he had many important roles in shaping the transformation of Cuba. I forgot to put my stopwatch on. I'll do that now. So then I obviously continued my engagement with Cuba, a growing network of friends and family on the island, and returning for the research for We Are Cuba, which is the book that I'm going to be talking about today, the filming of those documentaries, and now interviewing people for Cuba Analysis podcast. So I always describe Cuba as a country of contradictions. What do we mean by that? So for over 60 years, Cuba has arguably defied expectations and flouted the rules. It's a poor country with world-leading human development indicators. It's a small island that mobilizes the world's largest international humanitarian assistance. It's a weak and trade-dependent economy, but has managed to survive economic crises and the US blockade, now nearly a 4-month, nearly a 5-month oil siege. I mean, there are not many countries that could survive under those circumstances. In fact, in 2009, when the revolution was, the 50th anniversary of the revolution, so almost 50 years of the blockade, I interviewed the president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, at that time. And he said to me, Ecuador wouldn't last 50 days with this blockade that Cuba survived for 5 decades. So Cuba is always talked about as anachronistic, and yet it is very innovative. And I'll talk a little bit about their biotechnology sector. Formerly, Cuba is ostracized, but it has millions of ardent defenders around the world. And despite meeting many of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Cuba's development strategy is not upheld as an example. Okay, so the other way that I kind of build into the way that I talk about and analyze Cuba is in relation to the broader challenge of development. And this for me is so important because it helps us move beyond and away from Cuban exceptionalism, right? Which is a feature of studies on Cuba. And the challenge of development we can understand in these sort of very stylized questions. How do countries develop? Is it the free market or state action that is decisive? for developing countries, where can they get the capital that they need to invest in infrastructure and social welfare? And how can that foreign capital be obtained under conditions which do not in themselves obstruct independent development or undermine sovereignty? And how can international trade be used to produce a surplus in a global economy marked by deteriorating terms of trade or the unequal terms of trade? So my argument is that we have to understand the Cuban experience of socialism in relation to the struggle against underdevelopment. So looking at the nature of the Cuban Revolution, for the revolutionaries of the 1950s, in their analysis, they looked at all of the features of Cuba, its underdevelopment, the levels of exploitation, inequality, and their understanding was that imperialism was the principal explanation for the island's structural weaknesses. And this meant that the revolutionary government that took power had two real alternatives. Either it could renounce the objectives that were a part of what's called the Moncada program of revolutionary change. They could renounce those objectives, renounce fundamental changes in order for it to be acceptable to Washington and operate within the limits imposed by Cuba's subordination to the US. So they could get rid of Batista dictatorship and have a sort of new renovated national capitalism. But still subordinated, obviously, to the interests of US imperialism. Or they could pursue the deep structural changes that were necessary to break that dependent relationship and build real sovereignty. And that would mean inevitably confronting US imperialism and the interests of its allies in Cuba, the Cuban bourgeoisie, very weak, dependent bourgeoisie, whose position depended on its relationship to US interests. So the post-1959 government chose state action, that is the central plan and state ownership, over the free market as that lever to development in order to tackle Cuba's historical development challenges. Now, that might not seem anything extravagant to say here, but one of the biggest arguments in Cubanology and Cuba studies is that, Fidel Castro decided to ally with the communist countries to maintain his power. And it was also a sort of arbitrary decision or subjective decision. And clearly I'm saying that socialism was seen as the best development alternative in order to combat that dependent relationship and to combat imperialism and underdevelopment. So once that decision is taken, then Cuba faces the problem of how to build socialism in Cuba, in Cuban conditions, a small island developing state, which, whether it's socialist or capitalist, will always be dependent on trade. And under, the historical circumstances that Cuba has, its legacy of colonialism and imperialist domination by the United States, first Spanish colonialism, then US imperialism, and the legacies that's left in terms of the domination of the sugar plantations, the sugar economy. 80% of what Cuba exported was sugar, and the rest was sort of related to it in some way. The legacies of slavery and so on. So what we have that's consistent is a commitment to a planned economy and state ownership, and that hasn't changed since really it was adopted officially 1961. Fidel Castro announces on the eve of the Bay of Pigs invasion, this is a socialist revolution, but actually the ministries and the planning system had already been introduced by late 1960. However, beyond that, there has been a lack of consensus about how Cuba should increase productivity and efficiency within socialism. And a consequence of this constant adjustment and debate and so on has been, the first debate, which became retrospectively known as the Great Debate from the 1960s. It was initiated by Che Guevara, and it involved mainly Cubans, but there were also contributions from some foreigners, Charles Bettelheim and Ernst Mandel, in the great debate about which economic management system was most appropriate for Cuba in transition to socialism under Cuban conditions. And this debate has never been solved. It continues to today, and that's why we are constantly seeing almost like, I call it a pendulum swinging between different kind of systems, different approaches between the Guevarista notion of socialist transition and the more, let's say, practical, pragmatic, more Soviet influenced decisions. So just in the first 3 decades of the after the Cuban Revolution, there were 5 different economic management systems. And this is worth thinking about, because when people talk about the Cuban model, the Cuban system, what exactly are they referring to? What there has been in Cuba is a lot of debate, a lot of flexibility in response to international and domestic conditions. And there's been at least 3 distinct approaches in the post-Soviet period, and arguably now there's the sort of survival mode in which Cuba finds itself now. But what's common between all of these systems is that each one reframes the relationship between the market mechanisms and the state plan according, as I said, to those economic and political imperatives domestically and according to the economic conditions. And of course, when we talk about Cuban development, Cuban management of the economy, we always have to frame it in relation to the United States blockade, which massively constrains policy choices and decisions within Cuba. And, they can decide to develop an industry, but the United States introduces sanctions precisely to prevent that from happening. And there's many examples of that. So in the mid-1980s, Cuba introduced a period called rectification. The long term was called rectification of negative tendency errors and negative tendencies, which was an overt rejection of the Soviet management and planning system, which the Cubans had adopted by the mid-1970s. And it was an overt return to Che Guevara's critique of Soviet political economy and pulled Cuba away from the Soviet model. And Cuba began again to forge its own path. Arguably, this was really decisive in the survival of Cuban socialism when the rest of the socialist, Eastern European socialist countries and USSR collapsed. So the Cubans made a decision that they would not carry out a transition to capitalism as the other socialist bloc countries did. But the interesting thing is that they'd already started a process of moving away from the Soviet system, as I said, in the mid-1980s. Really from 1986, rectification was formally launched. And in July 1989, on their big national day, the 26th of July, which commemorates the attack on the Moncada barracks, Fidel Castro made an alarming statement during his annual speech. And he said, if we were to wake up and learn that the USSR had disintegrated, even under those circumstances, Cuba and the Cuban Revolution would continue struggling and resisting. And in my book, I cite someone who later was the Minister of the Economy and Planning, Jose Luis Rodriguez, who says that came out like a thunderbolt out of the sky, and it totally shocked us, because this, of course, was a year and a half or 16 months before the actual collapse of the Soviet Union. So the special period in Cuba was announced, although we always talk about it and think about it as if it's a direct response of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was actually announced 16 months before the collapse. And what it signifies is a sort of period of measures which constitute crisis management in a exceptional, extraordinary period, as if it was a war but without the war. And that was it was supposed to be a temporary measures, but this special period became an enduring feature of Cuban reality. in this period following the collapse of the socialist countries, Cuba committed to keep socialism, essentially. And against the economic rationality of capitalism, it prioritized welfare spending and social spending. And it used the plan and its planning system to harness and direct its scarce resources according to social and political priorities. So I just draw your attention to this graph, which shows unemployment and real GDP growth. So if you see the official unemployment, no, I'll start with the GDP growth. This is the line, and you can see how it really plummets between 1990 and 1993. So it's a 34% fall over those years of GDP. And what you would expect to happen, obviously, in any capitalist country is that unemployment goes up, right? You have an economic crisis, people lose their jobs. And what you see in Cuba is the opposite. And so this is a perfect demonstration of how the Cubans can be understood to make policy decisions according to their objectives of socialist development. Now, work in Cuba serves multiple functions. People are always talking about how low the salaries are in Cuba, although, the Cubans aren't eating the food. None of us eat the salaries. The question is what you can get with the salaries and what you need to get. And in Cuba, so much of people's needs are met through state provision that the salary doesn't have the same function, a comparable function. But so this wasn't just about keeping Cubans in work so that they would continue to get a salary. Work in Cuba has very political functions and social functions as well. It is the main site, one of the main sites through which people organize politically. The trade unions are very important. And in a period of economic crisis, it's more important under the Cuban system, the Cuban process, to have people engaged, debating and contributing to the decisions that need to be made. And in this period, that is the introduction of reforms and so on. Work is also important just for keeping people alive. In this period, workers receive food, they receive sustenance at work. So while the amount of food that was given out, distributed in the ration book was decreased, people were receiving food in their workplaces. So it's political organization, social and so on as well. So you see this this decision to keep people in employment, but it also helps us to understand the subsequent decision from 2011, when the economic situation had improved substantially, and the Cubans go through this process of restructuring their employment system and moving people out of the state sector or where they were into different areas of the state sector or into the non-state sector because of very low productivity and people employed, for a different reason, not for their productivity and efficiency. So the chapter in the book on surviving the crisis explains the particular vulnerability of the Cuban economy to that collapse. So Cuba was more state-dominated economy, more rigidly planned than most of the socialist bloc countries, and it explains how the whole economy had to be restructured. So Cuba loses 86 to 87% of its trade and investment, which comes from the Soviet bloc. That all just collapses. And Cuba has to restructure its entire economy from being principally an exporter of sugar and then reinsert itself into a global capitalist market without the counterbalance of the Soviet Union and those socialist bloc partners, and in an economy dominated by, a country that wants to destroy, that's openly declared it wants to see regime change. So it's an extraordinary, difficult thing that it does. And the chapter talks about the grave socioeconomic impacts of the crisis, the effect that it had on, child malnutrition, which appeared for the first time in many years, and how the Cubans moved immediately and very quickly to alleviate those social crises. It talks about the rise in inequality and illegality as the role of the export of sugar was replaced partly by the opening up of tourism, the service sector. Then later there was which I'll talk about, the role of medical professionals, exports. But I also talk about the waves of emigration, of people leaving the country, and that, of course, has to do with the US and how it was provoking that response. And there's changes in the agricultural system, the ownership system, but also a shift from a highly mechanized and highly kind of fossil fuel dependent, chemical dependent agricultural system to an agricultural system that is almost free of chemical fertilizers, that is basically organic. Particularly the law in Cuba is that urban agriculture cannot use chemical fertilizers. It's only retained on state farms for things like tobacco and sugar. So they carry out this extraordinary shift, which is one of the many measures that happens in this period that everyone agrees must be maintained, because although it's, you know, motivated by necessity, it actually improves Cuban development. And the other interesting aspect, which is another recurring feature of the Cuban experience post 1959, is that in moments of crisis, the Cubans understand that the Cuban state understands that it cannot just rely on repression to keep people on board with the socialist project. In fact, in the periods of crisis is when we've seen periods of deepening and extending community participation and mobilization. So decentralizing budgets and responsibilities to local communities in this process. It's a fascinating process to see how Cuba survived in that crisis, but it does survive. And by the 2000s, you have Cuba's relationship with Venezuela, and you have the newly elected president, Hugo Chavez, in Venezuela, and Cuba has an ally, and you know, this is the start of what's called the pink tide, as left-wing, or rather as social movements in Latin America sweep left-wing governments to power, various degrees of left-wing. That's why it's called the pink tide, not the red one. Now, in this period, lots of you, I'm sure, will remember the battle over Elian Gonzalez, the little Cuban boy who was shipwrecked at sea. His mother had taken him on a boat with a faulty engine, and they were trying to get to the United States, and most of them had died, but little Elian had been rescued. He was 5 years old, I think, at the time of his rescue. And what happened after that was a huge custody battle, because his father, who was still a loving parent and had, you know, didn't know that his mother was they'd divorced, and he didn't know she was intending to take him. He you know, demanded that the boy be returned to him, but in the US, they handed the Elian over to distant relatives who were part of the sort of Miami opposition. And then, of course, it gets jumped on by the right-wing exile community and the lobbyists and the politicians, and, you know, he's taken to Disney World and showered in toys, and this is all on television, and it becomes a battle over, you know, essentially which system is better for a small child, right? Is it a consumer capitalist society full of opulence, but without safety, security, or the love of his father or his family and his extended family in Cuba, or to grow up in socialist Cuba where he would be safe and loved and have excellent access to education and culture and so on. So what happens is that the Cubans start this battle to demand that Elian is returned, and it becomes an international campaign. Solidarity activists, you know, around the world take home T-shirts of Elian and also protest, and politicians for once in the international kind of discourse, people are speaking in favor of Cuba. But at the same time that this happens, you know, they win the battle. Elian is finally, the FBI breaks into the house in Miami where he's been staying or being kept, because they refused to release him when a court order said they should. They break in the FBI, heavily armed, and they return Elian to his father. They have to wait another couple of months in the US, and finally they return to Cuba. But meanwhile, the Cubans, particularly young people, have been marching and mobilizing, and there's been speeches about imperialism. This is the Bush administration, Bush presidency in the United States, and Elian is seen as a kind of symbol of the violation of Cuba's sovereignty. So you see the Cubans shift from just resisting to insisting, and this is a really important moment. But meanwhile, Fidel Castro gets this group of young leaders around him, young Cuban leaders, and he says, we need to investigate what is the situation in Cuban homes and schools and communities. Why is it that a mother would risk the life of her own child to go on this terribly dangerous boat trip, which so many have died carrying out, in order to get to the United States? Now, they understand the pull factors. Cuban citizens are the only citizens in the world that had, at this point, certain privileges. Until very recently, a Cuban can turn up in the United States legally or illegally at a legal port of entry or an illegal port of entry, and be given residence in the US, and then within a year become a US citizen. So we know the pull factors, but Fidel was saying we need to know what's happening in the Cuban homes, what has been the scars left, the damage done by the special period of economic crisis. So they set up this amazing battle of ideas, and they get groups of young people who are outside work and employment to go from being part of the problem to being part of the solution. They train them up as social workers, and they get them to work in their own communities and go into homes and talk to people and find out what they need, and then develop targeted programs of socioeconomic assistance, retraining people, finding them jobs, giving them support. This photo here shows a big group of the social workers. You can see most of them were non-white, most were women, a lot of also sort of single mums, and they had these amazing opportunities also to get into Cuban universities to study without passing the entrance exams, which were extremely demanding, and to start new careers. So it was an incredible process which launched hundreds of different socio-economic programs. The context is really important. As I said, this is the era of President Bush. And the hostility, you think of the wars and invasions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Meanwhile, they accused Cuba of developing chemical weapons, which was obviously nonsense. And they call Cuba, a rogue state. And it's John Bolton who reappears under the later Trump administration, but he's there, and they have Cuba in their sight hairs, definitely. And the Cuban response is to underscore the importance of education and culture in inculcating a commitment to socialism, to resist imperialist offensive, and the domestic interests in Cuba at that time who threatened socialist revolution. So people who are making money, corruption, stealing oil, not contributing in any way to society. This program was possible because of the economic improvements that had happened as Cuba came out of the 1990s. It meant that the state had new resources. It was able to address the material deprivation that had resulted from the special period, and for the first time, rather than just universal programs which give everyone the same support, to develop targeted programs and to recognize the inequalities that had remained in Cuban society. So it demonstrates the revolution's ability to rejuvenate the ranks of its leadership and the composition of its vanguard. New revolutionary protagonists, as I said, this disconnected youth, they become a citizens' army of social workers, emergent teachers, and medical internationalists. That's why I call this chapter Fidel Castro's Citizens' Army. He was very much battling from the front in this period. This is also, I'd say, Fidel Castro's last great battle. Some of the programs, I mean, multiple programs, including getting solar panels into rural schools. Some schools were set up for one student in mountains and so on. One of the most ambitious programs was they surveyed the entire population of under 16-year-olds in Cuba, not just weight and height, but they actually investigated their biopsychosocial situation, 2 million individuals in Cuba, and then developed programs to respond to their needs. An incredible kind of ambitious project. And growing out of that, by 2004, 2005, again, with the economic situation improving, now with better relations with China and the possibility of getting energy efficient equipment from China, they launched something called the Energy Revolution. So this chapter is called Power to the People, the Energy Revolution. Energy has always been for Cuba an issue of national security. What is it that the United States did almost straight after the revolution? They threatened Cuba's oil supply by telling the oil refineries that they must not refine Russian oil. What's the first thing the Russians did? The Soviets did? They supplied Cuba with oil. So this is a really key issue, and we're seeing this today more than ever when Cuba's facing Trump's oil siege. But let me just go back to what happened in this period, even further back. It was fascinating to me during my research to see that as early as 1968, the physics department at the University of Havana was carrying out research into photovoltaic technology. So they began looking at renewables technology in the late 1960s, but it stayed at the level of experimentation. And of course, they had a massive incentive to just continue with hydrocarbons because they had very cheap, abundant supplies of Soviet oil imports. But the situation was different by 2005, although they had imports of oil then from Venezuela. That's part of the Oil for Doctors program. They have these old Soviet technology refineries that were falling apart. They couldn't get spare parts. So a really big problem, which is continuing today, which is part of the reason they're having so many national blackouts. And so they tried to tackle this problem in 2005 with the Energy Revolution. They introduced 1,500 small distributed electrogenerators, they're called. They're much more appropriate for a transition to renewable energies, where you want to consume sources in the place where you develop them, so localized energy sources. They also handed out new they replaced many old durable goods. So these old refrigerators that the Cubans, every Cuban home had this old gas guzzling refrigerator. They replaced them and they gave Cubans new fridges, new TVs, new fans, and cooking pots. So some of this was handed out free. You can see this picture here. This is Fidel Castro examining a pressure cooker, and every Cuban family got a rice cooker and a pressure cooker for free. The first sign of the energy revolution for most Cubans, I was living in Cuba at the time, was these teenagers, with the red t-shirts that I showed you in the other slide, turning up with backpacks full of energy-saving light bulbs. And they went to every home in Cuba and they replaced their light bulbs for free. And Cuba, within 6 months, completed the switch, becoming the first country in the world to do so. So they also introduced a progressive new tariff, electricity tariff, so people who consume more would pay more. And, this was a moving away from that sort of universal provision, and introducing renewable energies. They start to produce solar panels in Cuba, particularly for these rural schools and so on, and rural clinics. So this process of a transition to renewable energies is embedded in the plan. They have something called the National Plan to 2030. It's part of that. It is obstructed massively by the US blockade, which affects technology and Cuba's access to capital, to loans from international financial institutions. Cuba cannot get loans, so it's very hard for it to make these big outlays of investments on technological changes, right? Because the US sanctions do not let it access money in the international financial system. However, with the relations with China, the situation has improved. And in early 2024, the Cubans announced that they would be building 92 huge, big solar panel parks with Chinese technology. This is not a donation from China. This is a commercial contract, but it's obviously facilitated by the governments. And this would raise the contribution of renewable energies to the energy matrix to between 50 and 60% by 2023. However, we've seen actions by the Trump administration to basically use energy to starve the Cubans into submission. So in December 2025, the US seized Venezuelan oil tankers and stole the oil, kidnapped the crews. Among that was oil that was destined for Cuba. On the 3rd of January, you then had the violent attack by the US on Venezuela, which attacked 4 different states, bombed 4 states, killed over 120 people, and abducted the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife, Celia Flores, and took them to the United States. And they made it clear that the US would no longer permit Venezuela to export oil to Cuba. So Cuba had not received any oil at all from anyone in the world since that oil tanker, because other countries also got intimidated. And then on the 29th of January this year, the US, Trump issued the first of 2 executive orders that he's issued this year, which effectively implemented an oil blockade of Cuba. It said that any country that donates or sells oil to Cuba will face robust and all-around US tariffs on its exports to the US. And no country has defied that except one oil tanker that arrived from Russia. I think it was the early April, with 750,000 barrels or 100,000 tons of oil. That is the only oil that Cuba has received since December 2025. So in this context, there's been a massive effort to accelerate the shift to solar panels, and international solidarity activists are contributing towards that. They're buying in the US. The campaign has bought loads of solar panels, and people are taking on different projects to do maternity homes or community centers and so on. So the shift is being expedited. But even not having oil for construction trucks is holding up that process, because you need to build the solar panel parks, you need oil for the construction. And in fact, most of Cuba's transport fleet is dependent on what you call gas, we call petrol or diesel. And so even with a shift to solar energy, it's not going to resolve the crisis for Cuba. There's questions like, Mexico, we can talk about all of this in the discussion. Mexico is sending huge big ships full of food and medicine, and that's great, but if they're docking in Havana or Mariel or Matanzas or wherever they are, how do you get them down to the rest of Cuba? Cuba's a long, thin island if you don't have fuel for transport, so it's very, very difficult. I'm going back now. I mentioned Cuban medical science, and they'll have a chapter in the book called The Curious Case of Cuba's Biotech Revolution. Dr. Augustin Laje, who's the director of the Center for Molecular Immunology, which has really developed some incredible advances, medicines and drugs. When I interviewed him, he said that biotech was the first time in its economic history that Cuba had incorporated itself into an emerging industrial sector. And it's really an extraordinary story. They set up something in 1981 called the Biological Front, with state investments in order to start work in this area. And while I've talked about how severe the economic crisis was in the special period, biotechnology was one of 3 areas which were protected during the special period. So it actually saw an increase of investment in that period. The other 2 areas were food production and tourism, because tourism was an important source of alternative income. Bear in mind that one of the big incentives to this is that the US blockade includes food and medicine and medical equipment, and people in the US will often tell you that's not true, but it is true. And there's plenty of reports from the UN and the World Health Organization and so on, and the Cubans themselves, about how they are blocked from access to medicine and medical equipment. One part of the US sanctions, it's not even a separate law, it's just one part, says that any equipment anywhere in the world, machinery, equipment, whether it's, Japan, Indonesia, the UK, if 10% or more of its components are produced by a US company or a US subsidiary, it cannot be sold to Cuba without the request for a license from OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Controls, on a policy of denial. So, this has made things extremely difficult in every sector for Cuba. I mean, I talked to for one of the documentaries, one of the people in charge of this system of national defense that responds to hurricanes and so on. They can't even get the latest equipment for detecting meteorological threats. So they set up their own biopharma sector. It's completely state-owned. It's very distinctive compared to the leading sectors globally. Profit is not sought domestically. They function on the basis of cooperation over competition. So all of the different institutes, their directors and so on, meet regularly once a month. They ask they share information about projects, they share resources and so on. It is completely integrated into the public healthcare system and the education system, and it is driven by public health demand. So right now, because the Cubans have done so well in terms of public health, they've eliminated poverty-related diseases, and the main ailments in Cuba, the main causes of mortality and morbidity are the same that we have in the advanced capitalist countries, right? So cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and the Cubans are working on extraordinary innovative products for those things, which we can talk about. I can give you more detail. I'm just aware of the time. So before Trump, when I was writing about this sector for my book, We Are Cuba, Cuba was able to produce nearly 70% of the medicines it needed domestically. That's fallen massively because the increase in sanctions. So Cuba can't get things like reagents that it needs to make its own medicines. During COVID-19, most of you know this, that Cuba was the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean to produce a domestic COVID-19 vaccines. It produced 3 different vaccines. They had extremely high efficacy, over 90%, which they've maintained, while the vaccines which we got, these revolutionary new vaccines, the efficacy falls very quickly, and very, very high safety because they're based on vaccine platforms that the Cubans have used before. They've developed, they know they're safe for newborn babies and so on. And yet, although they were able to do the science, when it came to mass vaccination, they were held up because they couldn't buy the syringes. And the reason they couldn't is because the US, if you remember, US companies were going around the world buying up syringe producers and producers of PPI and all the rest of it. And the Cubans couldn't get syringes, and it held up their mass vaccination campaign, which then led to a spike in cases, which was then related to the 11th of July 2021 protests and so on and so forth. So all of this is linked. But the Cubans have, when I wrote about it, it's much more now, nearly 200 inventions and products which are marketed in 50 countries. They have partnerships in countries throughout the global south. They have many world firsts. I keep talking about it, but let me just name them. The first country in the world to produce a meningitis B vaccine. The first country and only country to produce a lung cancer immunotherapy, which is actually currently under trial at Roswell Park Cancer Institute in the United States. The first to eliminate mother-to-child HIV transmission, the first human vaccine with a synthetic antigen. And now the Cubans are currently trialing in a very promising new Alzheimer's treatment, which the trials so far have shown that for 85%, there's no deterioration in cognitive capacity after taking this drug, but for 54%, their cognitive capacity improves, their memory returns. It's really extraordinary. No problems with side effects or safety. It's really extraordinary. And there is a doctor in the US who's also sending his patients to be part of a trial. Okay, so Cuban medical internationalism, as I said, this became very important for Cuba in financial terms or economic terms after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. But Cuba's always done this, right? In fact, it was 1960 when they first sent doctors overseas. 1 year after the revolution. Think about the context. They had a lack of physicians. They only had 6,000. Half of them left Cuba in the first years of the revolution, but they did this incredible job of building a public healthcare system from scratch and an education system from scratch. And by 2004, Cuba had more doctors per person than anywhere in the world. They have 3 times more than the United States per capita. So it's really extraordinary. And they always sent people around the world. They have different forms of assistance. So the first is the emergency medical brigades. I'm sure you're hearing in the news today about the new outbreak of Ebola in Africa. And you will remember that when there was the big outbreak in 2014 in West Africa, the Cubans sent the largest delegation of doctors to go and deal with that. And, during COVID-19, in the first year of COVID-19, the Cubans there were 57 brigades of Cuban epidemiological specialists, that's disease control and disaster response specialists, who went to 40 countries and treated 1.26 million people in 1 year. That's one form. The other form is helping countries to set up public health delivery. The other form is treating foreigners. So, I don't have time to give you examples of all of these, but there are many examples, and some of you will be thinking of them. And the fourth form of assistance is training foreigners as medics. Why do they do it? We hear all sorts of accusations that this is about soft power or the earnings, but none of these are sufficient as explanations, because they don't explain why Cuba was doing this for 5 decades completely without a financial recompense. I argue that revolutionary Cuba promotes a global struggle against underdevelopment. As I said, this is part of understanding Cuba's struggle for socialism, against colonialism, neo-colonialism, and imperialism. And they have been as ready to send soldiers during the Cold War as they have to send medics. And they see these, the struggle for national liberation, the struggle for public health, as part of the struggle against global inequality produced by unequal terms of trade and imperialist relations. So over 600,000 Cuban medical professionals have worked overseas in over 180 countries. Yes, that's most of the world. And they have also treated or trained tens of thousands, maybe millions of people in Cuba. Now, there is a Guatemalan researcher, Henry Morales, who has taken the data on how many kind of surgeries and consultations Cuba's done, and given them a financial value according to the way that the OECD does value its own contributions in this way. And what we have, according to when he gives Cuba an equivalent value, Cuba's overseas development aid, that's ODA there, has been 71.5 billion just in this period, 1999 to 2015, which is equivalent of 6.6% of its annual GDP. This compares to an annual contribution of 0.17 from the United States and 0.39 from European countries. Cuba's healthcare missions have been pivotal to Latin America's welfare-focused development strategies since the 2000s, and the principal source of revenue from the same period. The United States has set out to sabotage Cuban prestige and the revenues that it receives. And we've seen that attempt stepped up as well, particularly led by Rubio under the current administration. Now, I have a chapter on Cuba-US relations, and this has become really relevant again. At the time when I was writing my book, I spoke to Josefina Vidal, who had led Cuba's team in the secret negotiations that happened with Obama's team to lead to the rapprochement announced in December 2014. And she said, history has shown that pressure, preconditions, and aggression do not work with Cuba. And I think that this is a lesson that Trump is going, through the process of, we hope, of learning at present with the current maximum pressure and the threats of invasion and so on underway. There's been decades of conflict between the countries, but the balance of power has been obviously with the United States, although we must be clear that Cuba has not been a subservient neighbor. It's supported revolutionary movements, it's supported socialist governments, it's supported national liberation movements, and it has spoken out against imperialism in many international forums, in favor of Palestine, in favor of Puerto Rican independence, and so on and so forth. The US has undertaken overt and covert operations, sabotage and terrorism, the US blockade, which is completely, actually, since the beginning, extraterritorial. So although in Britain there is legislation that protects me from the US blockade, that's not implemented. And I am also subject to the US blockade of Cuba. I, with a British bank account, cannot send £1 to someone in Europe if I put the word Cuba in the transaction. So that pound doesn't even go to Cuba, and it's not even being converted into dollars. But that is the extent of the US blockade. And of course, we've seen the recent measures are just devastating. It has pursued Cuba's isolation politically and regionally. It's promoted illegal and dangerous emigration, including of minors, so very young children that were sent on their own, including of medics who worked overseas. It's encouraged them to abandon missions. It's obstructed legal migration, and there has been massive funding for regime change programs, which the Congress approves 20 million overtly every year. This has created many vested interests. I think we're seeing that play out now. Marco Rubio is a product of these vested interests. He has built his career with funding from the right-wing Miami Cuban lobby. And, these people don't want to see relations improve because they've built their careers on this conflict, let's say. So in 2017, Trump massively intensified aggression with over 240 new measures, actions and sanctions, including during the pandemic. And now, as we've seen, Trump is threatening regime change. He says he's going to have the honor of taking Cuba and that he can do what he wants with it. If you'd like to know, those were his words. The Cuban state, meanwhile, has devised versatile methods of defense. International solidarity has been vitally important. So we should bear that in mind in the current period. Okay, then I have a chapter on Raul's reforms. Raul Castro took over informally in 2006 as the vice president after Fidel Castro got ill. He was elected formally in 2008 as the president of the Council of State. And there were a few measures then, but from mainly 2011, we've had this process of reforms, which was initially called the Guidelines for Changing the Political and Social System. The reforms aim to improve efficiency and productivity within the socialist framework. So dealing, for example, with that problem of keeping people at work for political and social reasons, even though they're not contributing effectively to productivity. It meant opening space for market mechanisms, seeking foreign direct investment and remittances. Remember that Cuba needs capital, obviously, to invest in its infrastructure and social welfare and so on, but it cannot access it through multilateral development banks, through IFIs, international financial institutes. So those were the mechanisms that it used to get capital into the country. the chapter discusses each of the problems that each of the reforms were introduced to address and the results of those. Structural changes led to a rebalance of the economy to bolster the domestic economy in response to complex international conditions. So this, of course, is overlapping with the international financial crisis and the repercussions of that. But there is a tension between political preference and economic necessity. And in fact, at one point, there's a group of Cuban sociologists and social scientists who demand that the reform process is halted and that the drive for efficiency is not prioritized over social welfare. They point out that people are being left behind in Cuba as certain benefits have been withdrawn. And there is a kind of rectification in this process. This whole period, like 10 years of Raul Castro's mandate, is characterized by extensive participation in national and sectoral consultations and debates which shape policy and legislation. And that was so important to secure the legitimacy and acceptance of changes that would be introduced under new leadership and with the end of the veteran generation. So the guidelines themselves, you see these young people reading this booklet, those were the guidelines. There were over 300 different measures. The Cuban population debated these for months and made critiques, suggestions, and as a consequence, 68% of those guidelines were actually changed before they began to be implemented. Now, this creates contradictions within the Cuban political economy, market exchanges increasing, private accumulation, changing social relations, new forms of ownership and management. And this chapter, where I look at these debates and the consequences, I call the Cuban tightrope, because Cuba is kind of trying to move forward, balancing between the market and the plan. As I said, there's an internal debate in which Cuban social scientists criticize the economic reforms with their focus on economic efficiency at the cost of social equity. And they demand that actions halted in order to address this growing inequality and marginalization. So there are measures, these measures are taken, they halt that process. The state reinforces control over production, distribution, and prices to protect the population. But this coincides, of course, now with Trump coming in 2017. The US blockade is tightened, and you know, many of its measures are designed to particularly target anything owned by the state, and they allow possibilities for non-state sector, that's cooperatives, private, small, medium-sized businesses. So this acts as a sort of drive to increase reforms out of necessity. But what the Cubans have demonstrated is that there is a tendency to reassert the centrality of social justice in the development of their process, even at the cost of economic growth. Now, as I said, I had to add a chapter to the end of the book because the Trump measures had come in, and there was a return to the Cold War hostility under Trump. Marco Rubio, who represented the Cuban American power brokers. The result was oil, food, and equipment shortages, foreign investors scared off, trade partners scared off, Cuban revenues blocked, including in healthcare services. And by 2020, when my book was published, we were talking about the return of the special period. And the question was not how they survived the special period, but how they would survive the Trump period or the post-rapprochement period. And we saw how the state mobilized existing apparatus to channel resources, increase control over distribution to protect the population, rise of salaries, and a search for domestic solutions. The photo shows a queue. This is during COVID. Cubans having to get up at 4 or 5 in the morning to queue for scarce goods that the state was still supplying to them. And in the midst of all this difficulty, you have a new president who comes in. He was born after the revolution. He's entirely a product of Cuban socialism, Miguel Díaz-Canel. You have a new constitution, which is voted, subject to debate, national debate, like the guidelines before it, and voted in a referendum, and a new families code, which is regarded as one of the most progressive in the world, which again is subject to months of debate before being voted in a referendum. So now, I mean, that was the sort of the end of the story before the latest measures. And I've just added two, I think it's two more slides. So bear with me because I know I'm kind of running over. This is about Trump and Rubio, who have said that they're seeking regime change in Cuba by the end of this year. So we've talked about the attack on Venezuela and Venezuelan oil exports to Cuba. Trump has issued two executive orders, first on the 29th of January 2026 and the second on the 1st of May, in response to at least 500,000 Cubans going out to march for May Day in solidarity with the socialist revolution and celebrating socialism, and over 6 million Cubans signing a petition demanding, Cuban be left in peace and so on. And the response was this second executive order, which incredibly expanded and deepened, broadened extraterritorial sanctions. And immediately, once those were kind of written out on the 7th of May, you had a Canadian oil company, Sherritt, that's been working in Cuba for 30 years, has been so important, helping with their oil production and nickel production, has immediately pulled out, and other companies as well. So within 2 weeks of that the oil blockade of the 29th, you have this statement by the UN Human Rights Office about how catastrophic this has been, with intensive care units, emergency rooms compromised. It's affected the storage of vaccines and blood products, all sorts of medicine. 80% of water pumping equipment in Cuba depends on electricity. So when there's no electricity, there's no lights, your fridge is off, the food goes off, you also get no water. It's undermining everything. The rubbish collection trucks, I'm sure you've seen those photos of huge big piles of rubbish. It's disrupted the rationing system, basic food basket, affected social protection and so on. But the Cubans continue to commit to defend their country and Cuban and the socialist society. As I said, 500,000, maybe 600,000 were out in Havana, and around the rest of the country, there were millions more. And they've accelerated the installation of solar panels. It's often now solar panels are meeting 50% of the demand during the day. Where they're struggling is, as I said, in transport, but also in they have a lack of storage capacity, so keeping the electricity at night. Okay, so the final point was to say that international solidarity is vital in this period where essentially there is the threat of a genocide against the Cuban people. We need concrete action to defend Cuba. The US government must be held accountable for its crimes. I've written this because obviously I'm in Britain. The British government must be told, we must demand that it implements British laws and policy, and that British banks unblock Cuba because they're violating our own rights outside of Cuba. So this is relevant for those of us wherever we are outside the US. And we must make the demand on international bodies like the UN, BRICS, the EU, the Group of 77, to send fuel to Cuba and other essential goods. The US doesn't have the right to decide who Cuba trades with as a sovereign nation. And then, of course, on an individual level, much easier to do, we can donate material aid to the organizations that are buying food, medicine, solar panels, and so on, and travel to Cuba, because in this crisis, the act of traveling to Cuba has become an act of solidarity. And that's it. I'm sorry I went slightly over. I always get relaxed into my conversation before I realized how much time had gone.
Well, thank you very much, Helen. Very informative and shocking and scary in a number of ways, especially the last few pieces of information. Anyway, since we are running a little over, let's open it up for questions and answers. Just I ask everyone to try and be brief so that more people have a chance to participate. And I'll ask for the assistance from Yvonne and Daniel in terms of any questions or processing of questions. I'm not seeing.
If there are no questions after that, I'm done. I'm gonna
have a question.
I'm gonna have such
I'll
a
have
song.
questions if need be, but I'm just.
I'm wondering about what is happening this, I think it's yesterday, right? Like they are opening a process to against Raul Castro, like trying to find an excuse to do the same thing they did with Maduro. So what do you think is going to happen with the current situation with Russia and China, and that they're supporting Cuba, um, but the whole thing with the war and all the situation in the West Asia, how is this changing the panorama for doing an invasion on Cuba as a way to show something to achieve? Because they already lost the war in Iran. So do you think that that is going to happen, or how is that going to be um, the coming weeks for Cuba?
Do
I'm
you
going to
want me
advocate we take a few questions. Is that
Okay.
okay, Helen?
That was 3 questions, but yeah, go on.
Are you,
No, go ahead. Take a few more.
Please use the raised hand for those who wish to pose a question.
I mean, I'd be interested to know how much those of you here knew about some of the things I talked about, like, you know, the biotech developments, Cuban medical internationalism, the shift to sustainable development, the reform process, the families code.
For myself, I learned quite a few new things, and I didn't realize the beginning of the special period was so far in advance of the fall of the Soviet Union. Or maybe I'd been told by good old Al back in the day, but I'd forgotten about it. Anyway, so if we don't have another person asking a question now, why don't you respond to Yvonne's uh, questions?
Steve's, wasn't it?
Well, Steve is what he appears as. That's just because that's who's hosting it, but it's actually Yvonne, a
Okay,
member of
sorry,
our webinar committee.
I'm just
Yeah,
reading the
you can
name
say
of
Steve.
person. Yeah, so I mean, obviously those are like the question. I've done like hundreds of years of history, but what happened yesterday? I know that is the question, because things are moving so fast. The indictment of Raul, I think that, you know, I've said they've had these 2 executive orders accusing Cuba of being a threat to the extreme and an unusual threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. And it is absurd. I mean, everyone's saying it, right? So this is an attempt to justify that, right? So you can say, how can they threaten the international community? Oh, yes, well, 30 years ago, Raul Castro was the head of the army and this incident happened. Now, the Cubans are clear, according to the Cubans, the shooting down of the Brothers to the Rescue airplanes was over Cuban territory. Now, they claim it was in international seas, and, you know, I was living in Cuba at the time when this happened, and they had been flying over. I'd actually left Cuba to go to Mexico for visa reasons at the time the shoot down happened, but they had been coming over all the time. Like, this was not the first time they went over Cuba. They've been dropping leaflets to call on people to rise up. Can you imagine if the Cubans had done the same, flying over Washington, dropping leaflets to call for the American people to rise up against their government? So the Cubans had people who had infiltrated these right-wing Miami-based groups, the Brothers to the Rescue and others. They're well known. The story of that is well known now. It's the WASP network. There's a film. There's even a film on Netflix. There's an even better film made by 2 Scottish film directors, Castro's Spies. And they knew that they were planning to return with violent actions, not just dropping leaflets. So the shoot down happened. Why are they indicting Raul Castro, 94-year-old man, now? I think partly to justify the executive orders. But I think you may be right. Are they laying the groundwork for some sort of military action as was taken? Because, of course, they had done similarly to Maduro. Are they going to come and try and kidnap Raul Castro at 94? I don't know. Maybe they are. I mean, you're asking me, what do I think would happen? I think, as a historian, I always say it's very vainglorious for a historian to try and predict the future, but to try and predict Trump, I mean, you know, you'd have to change your prediction every hour. So I don't know what they think they're doing, but I will tell you this: I think they realize, and if they don't, they should, that Cuba is a very different scenario from Venezuela, and the response from Cubans would be very different from the response that they met in Venezuela when they attacked. So, you know, 32 Cubans died putting up a fierce resistance protecting Maduro when they attacked. 32, there were Cubans who were protecting him. And, you know, the discourse from Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel has said it, the Cubans, I was in Cuba in January when the remains of these 32 Cubans were brought back. And it was a really cold day. I was like, my gosh, I'm from Glasgow and it's colder today than Glasgow. Now, normally Cubans, you know, first drop of rain, they run away. I mean, probably 100,000, maybe 200,000 stood waiting in the rain and the freezing cold for hours just to file past and pay their respects. And I did what's called vox pops, you know, when you go up to people and say, why are you here? How do you feel? What do you think? And, you know, the response was resolute. Like, we're here because they were upset and angry that their compatriots had been killed in this brutal attack. And I asked them, are you scared? And they said, no, I'm not scared. Even young women, we put together a little video. It's on the Cuba Analysis streams. They said, no, we're not scared. But they said, if they come here, you know, that was the resistance they met from 32 Cubans, that if they come here, they'll meet that resistance from 10 million. So I think that the US know that. The military did a calculation like 1960, and they said, how much would it cost us? And, you know, how costly would it be to try and invade Cuba? And they said at that point, they said, no, it's too costly. We can't attempt to do that. What I think is the strategy is that they want to make Cubans suffer so much that there is an uprising, that there is some sort of violent protest like we saw on the 11th of July. And they would only then would they consider militarily or directly intervening, because then they could use the pretext that it's some sort of humanitarian intervention. But they will find a very different scenario if they attempt to intervene directly in Cuba. So, I mean, in terms of Russia, as I said, is the only country that sent a tanker of oil. They have another one, which is supposed to be on the way to Cuba, but it's kind of meandering around the Atlantic at the moment. It's got only a third of the amount of oil that the last one had. In terms of China, we know very little about the conversation between Trump and the president of China. But we know that there were conversations and Trump's been quite muted. We know that China and the president has openly said very directly that they do not accept the executive orders and the attempt to starve Cuba. They oppose that, and I don't know whether they talked about it. But it's also clear that Trump has said that they won't deal with Cuba until they've dealt with Iran. And I think Iran is doing an extraordinary job of tying up the United States, and it could work either way. It could make them, remove all of their appetite for a similar military entanglement in Cuba. Or it could be that Trump actually believes Rubio and his other advisors that it would be a quick and easy victory. And he thinks that that would somehow distract from the failure to destroy Iran. He made a totally absurd comment about, on the way back from Iran, we'll just like park up the Abraham Lincoln, off the coast of Cuba, and they'll go, oh, okay, we give in. I mean, if that's what he thinks, like his advisors, totally got it wrong, because there is no way. Even Cubans who are highly critical of the government, are saying that we wouldn't accept an intervention, because this is very deep historical roots of Cuban anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. They've had century of fighting for freedom, for independence, and this this commitment to sovereignty is very deeply rooted in Cubans. And, you know, I think that the United States doesn't get it, but they will if they try and invade. So I don't know if that answers your questions.
Yeah.
I'm going to pose a quick question, then I'm going to pass it to Yvonne for these other two questions. What you describe in terms of the lack of access to oil and medicine presents a close to existentialist crisis. Because the solar panels and the capacities depend upon them, we're months, if not years away. And if you can't get, for instance, the aid that came from Mexico. So my concern, I'm just curious your opinion, the lack of international solidarity with Cuba, with the exception of some aid from Mexico and the one oil shipment from Russia, is shocking. But it's consistent with the way the world is reacting to Trump. They're all scared of him. And every country across the globe, it's incredible how he's being accommodated, even though he's known as being a taco. And this I see as it's just not so much that the Cuban people will react against the government, but the suffering and the non-functioning, given the problems of blackouts and so on and transportation. That's where I see it as problematic. Now, I don't know what the alternatives are within Cuba to try to survive without getting those kinds of supplies. And I believe Yvonne has a couple questions from the chat. If we can add those in so that.
Yeah, so there are two questions, one from Vanita and the other one from Anna Marie. Vanita says, thank you for illuminating presentation on Cuba. I have a question, the family code. Can you elaborate on it, especially if it addresses hierarchies of gender relations within the family? And Anna Marie says, thank you so much for the talk. I feel that political economy analysis of the Cuban crisis also requires a critical assessment of the role of the state and the Cuban government in dealing with this difficult external situation, in delaying reforms, prioritizing some type of reforms over others, tweaking the political speech, etc. So I'm interested in listening to your opinion on the Cuban state responsibility in the crisis. Can all Cubans' problems be attributed to the US blockade? Not now, of course. I agree with the critique of the extreme form of the sanctions and US hostility have taken, but the crisis didn't start there. And she cannot ask this because she's in a meeting.
Yeah. Okay, fine. I mean, in case you're wondering, I'll answer it. So shall I go now? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
The lack of international solidarity. And by the way, I think we're talking at the level of governments, right? Not individuals, because there has been extraordinary solidarity. Well, there has and there hasn't. I mean, there could always be more at the sort of people-to-people level. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. That's what I was saying on my last slide. Think of a country like Angola. Do you remember Cuba's engagement in Angola? Cuba sent 400,000 soldiers and civilians, mainly soldiers, to defend the newly independent Angola from the invading army of apartheid South Africa, which had already occupied Namibia. Yeah, and was, you know, going to sort of expand itself into Angola. And you know, it was being attacked. There was a civil war. It was attacked from forces funded by the US and so on. And the Cubans defended Angolan independence and battled the apartheid South African army. And Nelson Mandela called this decisive. The Battle of Quito Quinoare was decisive and was, you know, part of the contributing to the end of apartheid in South Africa. Angola has oil. Why is Angola not sending oil to Cuba? You know, what about the countries in Latin America? I mean, Colombia has sent some food and medicine as well. But I think you're right. They are intimidated and they are threatened. And there is a lack of international solidarity. Cuba is what do you call it? Like an observer member of BRICS. Why is the BRICS not standing in? If the BRICS allows a member or, some sort of associated member to be destroyed with, genocide, which is what they're proposing, then what example does that give? What's the lesson there? And in fact, what we can see is that they have this confidence to behave like that because of what happened, what Israel did to the Palestinians with full support from the United States. It just, they had complete impunity. And then the fact that they were able to kidnap the sitting head of state of Venezuela, and almost nothing was said in response. There was no uproar internationally. And now they have so much confidence, it's given them so much confidence. They talk about the Venezuela model, and the notion that, we can just go in and remove an elected head of state. It is alarming, to say the least. And that's why I say, we need to be putting pressure on and making that demand. But as individuals, we're very limited. You can have a feeling of really a lack of power, but it's only by working together and working collectively that we can actually have, as Jose Marti would say, contribute a grain of sand towards this. It's very difficult. Why are they not helping? Cuba, I've just given you the statistics, the Cuban contribution to the global South and even to the global North, because when COVID hit Europe, it hit Italy. Italy was the epicenter of the world. Everyone else ran away. I remember an Italian being on television saying, well, why have we been abandoned? But the Cubans ran there. They ran there. The Cubans held together the healthcare system in an emergency period in a region in Italy, right? So why aren't they helping? I don't know. I think it's outrageous. And I think that the more that there is a lack of international solidarity, the more that the imperialist countries will get this, this incredible arrogance that they can do what they want. The whole post-war consensus, world of laws, international norms and all the rest of it is totally been ripped up. It's totally like, you can't even have a pretense about it. And, don't ask me, ask the president of Canada, who came out and said that the other day, right? So I don't know if that answers your question. I agree with you. It's appalling and alarming. In terms of the question, was it Vanita asked about the Families Code? The Families Code, I would encourage you to look into it, or to look at articles about it. It's extraordinary. It's considered one of the most, if not the most progressive in the world. It's called Families Code because it recognizes that families take all sorts of shapes and sizes. It also, recognizes it gives rights to, the most vulnerable in family relationships, and in terms of surrogacy and different gender identities and so on and so forth. So yes, absolutely. They had, just to be clear, they had a Families Code that was passed in 1976 with the new constitution, the first constitution, the revolutionary government that introduced, and that already officially got rid of hierarchies in families, but it didn't incorporate the issue of same-sex relationships and gender identities in the way that this new family code does. So it's an extraordinary thing. Now, what's really interesting about it, because other countries can have progressive legislation, right? And it's just a bit of paper. The Cubans could have done that. They could have said, we have a new law, here's the law. But they don't have that approach in Cuba because they recognize that unless you get the population on board through education, then you can have amazing rights on paper, but you're going to have the same problems of repression and prejudice, discrimination, because it's in people's minds, right? And it infects society. So they went through this process of debating the Families Code so that it would be an educational process in itself. And it was quite a big battle. The Catholic Church, or different churches in Cuba, mobilized against the Families Code, and there were other interests, and they were battling against deeply ingrained legacies of chauvinism, or machismo as they call it, inherited from the Spanish, also from the period of US domination. But they used the debates, the months of debates, as an opportunity to actually, in a way, it was another battle of ideas. And that is how they tend to approach these questions in Cuba. So fascinating. In terms of the role of the state, I didn't quite get all of the questions, but I think essentially, you know, you're saying, and I was listening to a journalist today. I listened to an interview. It was done yesterday with Bruno Rodriguez, who is the Minister of International Relations. Watch it. It's an extraordinary interview with CNB or CNN or someone, so one of the mainstream media, and they were asking the same in a more extreme. Oh, you know, but the US says that actually the inefficiencies, the blackouts, the problem of energy is not the fault, or, you know, the US fault. It's actually inefficiencies in the Cuban government. Okay. I also appreciate that the question was, what's the word, like, you also added that that it's not at this moment when Cuba's under attack, but it's not about attacking Cuba more by saying that. But actually, I would encourage you to listen to what the Cuban leadership is saying, right? They have said very clearly, and he says it, Bruno Rodriguez says it in this interview, we've made mistakes. They have made mistakes. I can give you one example of something that happened that was that is acknowledged to have been a mistake, and it was the decision to unify the currencies, the Cuban convertible pesos and the national pesos, which happened on the 1st of January 2021, right? So it was a decision. It was a process they had started many years before. They were working towards it. They were trying to create the conditions, and then COVID struck. And the Cubans had done so well in the first year of COVID, 2020. I actually made a documentary about Cuba's response to COVID in the first year of COVID, which showed how well they'd controlled contagion, fatalities. But they opened up Cuba so to allow Cubans who were outside the country to come back and so on, and then they had a spike, and this coincided with the unification of money of the currencies and an increase in sanctions by Trump, and it has led to inflation that they've never seen before in Cuba since the revolution. It's led to a sort of set of problems. Now, yes, fine, is that, you know, the Cuban government made policy mistakes, but, you know, you also have to remember the point that I made at the beginning. Their capacity to develop policies and to make decisions is also constrained by the US blockade, you know. And it's like the Cubans say, it's like blaming us for the problems that we have. It's like blaming someone for not knowing how to swim when you've tied a rock around their ankles and sunk them to the bottom of the pool. And in a sense, you know, the fact that Cuba, unlike anywhere else in the world, cannot get a loan, a lend of the last resort loan, in a moment of crisis because of US sanctions. How do you get through a crisis? How do you get through COVID? How do you buy this extraordinary supplies that you need, right? Well, the rest of the world could get a loan. They could get an emergency loan, and Cuba can't do that. So, yes, of course, there are mistakes. I mean, you know, Cuban government is made up of human beings, and human beings are flawed. And in fact, they have the former minister of the economy who oversaw that process of the unifications of currency, who's currently in prison and has been indicted for quite serious charges. A Cuban minister, not last time I was in Cuba, the time before, in summer last year, a Cuban minister who was the Minister of Labour came out with a statement that was just jaw-droppingly insensitive and wrong. She said there are no beggars in Cuba. The people that you see rifling through rubbish, they've chosen to because they are getting, you know, she's talking about the fact that they're looking for tin cans that can be recycled and you can get paid for returning them. And she said, oh no, they're just expropriating national resources without paying taxes. And it caused so much uproar in Cuba. Cubans were so disgusted that she'd come out with this comment that less than 24 hours later, she was forced to resign. Okay, so yeah, they have problems, they make mistakes, they have bad people, doing the wrong jobs, but that's their problem, that's their issue. Let the Cubans make all of the mistakes that they want, but let them breathe. At the moment they can't breathe, and so this is the issue. The blockade, they're always saying, oh, it's a failed state. Well, remove the blockade and let's see how Cuba does, right? Let them fail on their own account and not because they're being asphyxiated. That's my response.
Anyone else?
Hello. Let me try a small question. My name is Conrad Harold. I've been to Cuba 4 times, leading student groups from Pinar del Rio to Santiago de Cuba to Havana, etc. How will Cuba defend itself if the United States does try to invade? In the Bay of Pigs, they needed gasoline and tanks and bullets and so forth. How can Cuba defend itself now?
So, great question. Shall I just go on and answer that, or are there more?
Go ahead,
Okay.
unless there's a hand flying up.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So, one of the things that they did in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, I'm sure, right, that the Soviets had a military defense pact with Cuba. They reneged on it in the mid-1980s, which contributed towards Cuba's decision to implement rectification. They said they will no longer, honor this. But the Cubans, and this was down to Raúl Castro, very much so, they developed a new concept for their national defense, right, which was a people's defense, an armed people. And so they, that's part of it. It's very linked to their national defense, full stop, which you can see, rolled out for hurricanes and other kind of natural disasters, right? So, every single street has a committee for national defense, has a street committee, it has every area has an office of national defense, and so on and so forth. So people know. I was in Cuba during a Category 4 hurricane, and it was just an extraordinary experience to see how I was living with Cubans in a Cuban street, to see how they mobilized, right? This hurricane was moving. It was Hurricane Dennis, if you want to look it up. It was moving very slowly, very strong hurricane, slowly up the island. So we could see what was happening as it was moving up, and, televised reports until the electricity gets turned off preemptively in each place before it arrives. And, everyone, I was in a house of 13 people. Everyone knew their role, right? Some of them were to take the elderly to a shelter to look after them. Some of them were to, as soon as the hurricane passed, to pick up debris to get the roads cleared and all sorts of things. And this was a house of non-specialists, right? Just people. So it's the same for their military response. I don't have an insight into how the army will respond, but I know that I was also in Cuba when Fidel got ill, right? And he announced he got ill, and I was traveling around different parts of Cuba, and I saw that the reservists were called up and they were doing their training and they were getting ready because Bush was making noises. And I'm sure that's going on. They had recently, they call it the national, what do they call it? Something National Day of Defense thingies. So yeah, okay, they've run out of petrol. They've said they got no reserves. Does that count the army? I don't know. Maybe the army has its own reserves. But one interesting aspect is that the Cuban army has always been ahead of the game in terms of renewables. And I found this out through doing my research, and I was talking to, the president of Cuba Solar, which is an NGO, non-government organization promoting solar energies. It was set up in 1994. And he said to me that he was telling me about how, the army, that, by the way, the army were the first to introduce organiponicos, which is this sort of organic, well, because you've been to Pinar del Rio, presumably you've seen them, right? The army introduced them first, and the army were very quick to introduce solar panels as well. So they maybe have electric vehicles? I don't know. I don't want to speculate because, as I say, I have no military insights. But I remember him telling me that he was asked for a meeting by Vilma Espin, who was the wife of Raúl Castro. He said, "I want to talk to you." So he was going as the president of this, Cuba Solar. And he prepared himself. He said, I prepared myself to give a speech to convince her of the importance of solar panels and solar energy. And when we met, she sat down and gave me a speech about the importance of solar energy. So I said, well, my work's done. So, they're not stupid. There's no surprises. The Cubans have lived with the threat of military invasion since 1959. Second half of 1959, the CIA were already carrying out actions and planning, right? And Lester Mallory's memorandum, 6th of April 1960, lays out the fundamentals of what becomes US policy towards Cuba, which is a recognition that the new government is very popular, that they can't turn people against it, that the people would oppose an invasion, and therefore we need to use economic warfare to cause, and these are the words, hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. So the Cubans are prepared. They will be prepared. Nothing is more powerful than the US military technology. That's what we're hearing, right? That's what we're hearing. But Iran has held them off. I mean, Iran, they thought they'd be in and out of Iran. And actually, there was a very interesting comment from Trump, because he, after the abduction of Maduro in Venezuela, he tried to make it sound like it was a 5-minute in and out job. But then at a later point, he made a statement. He says, the Cubans, they're tough people, because he's referring to the resistance that they confronted. And there was one of these occasions where he's speaking and he's surrounded by people, and they got this guy on stage and gave him a medal. And he was the pilot of one of the Chinook helicopters that went to Venezuela, and he was awarded a medal. The man couldn't even smile, by the way. He walked on with, he had to have aid walking, leaning on something. He was shot in the leg. In a Chinook, these things are supposed to be impenetrable. And he was the pilot. Presumably he didn't get out. So, who shot him in the leg? Well, from what we hear, it was the Cubans who were giving a ferocious resistance. And, there's all these stories about the US had this technology that froze everything, right? That made all technology work. I don't know. I just know, as Bruno Rodriguez says, and he's asked the same question in the interview I just referred to, which I just listened to his interview today. He says, if there is an attempt to attack Cuba, it will be in a bloodbath for the Cubans and for the US as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, if there's no other questions, I guess the question on everyone's mind is, how will they pull it out? But thanks to Helen for a very informative talk, but also one that reminds us of the resolution and the faith and capacity of the Cuban Revolution. Not that it's an easy time, but same thing as a special period that somehow it comes through. And all the same, I'd like to have feeling maybe Helen can pass on to us those couple links for issues of individual aid, but also pushing to pressure governments and an organization like the BRICS. The BRICS is a huge number of countries, which includes China, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, all that are allegedly allies of Cuba. There should be a much more serious response, at the very least, another tanker, but also medicine. So I really appreciated your presentation. It's very informative, Helen, and I'm going to continue reading the book that I've started of We Are Cuba. Someone asked about if the slides are be available. Well, we'll talk with Helen about that.
Yeah, that's fine. I can send you them to circulate.
Very good. So
And in terms of like, I think there's someone in the chat, I'm just catching up with the chat now, who says they were from India, but I think most of you have logged on from the United States. Is that right? Yeah. So, you know, in the US, their sort of main umbrella organization is the US Cuba Normalization Committee. If you contact them, they will be able to tell you who's doing what in your area. Because there's, if you're in Los Angeles, there's Hands Off Cuba in Los Angeles. You know, People's Forum is extremely active and have a big fundraising for solar panels. They've raised over $500,000. They're based in New York. So I'm sure all of this is like easily findable for you, but I would encourage you to do something, whatever you do. Just, even if it's the easiest thing, is just donate money, even if that's all you do. I put on the slide a QR code for a bank account in the UK. That's Cubans in the UK. That's a organization of Cubans who are raising money. They've just done a solar panel for a community center, which organizes with you know, children with special needs, and now they're doing something for a center for people with autism. So you can of course donate to them. That was the Solidarity Network. It's on the slide, so if Paul sends them out, then you can use your QR code and go straight through. It's really problematic. I just want to say, as someone who's been involved in solidarity, like, even though we're in Britain, Britain has law that says it's illegal to implement the US blockade against British citizens who want to engage with Cuba or transact with Cuba. Even though that law is in place, we still find incredible obstacles. We cannot use a crowdfunding site to set up a fund to raise money for Cuba. We struggle to use bank accounts. We can't use things like PayPal. We've done, you know, like classical music concerts to raise money to buy a classical piano for a music conservatory, and the money gets confiscated by PayPal or Eventbrite or whoever it is. So it's really hard. So if you see things like, you know, a QR code that goes straight through to a payment form, that's why. It's all the time. If you imagine that's what we have to do, what does Cuba have to do to transact, right? To carry out its basic trade? It's so hard. It's so hard.
Well, thank you very much, Helen. A great kickoff to our webinar series, and hopefully we'll have many more, and hopefully I'll hear future updates. Thanks again. Thanks for everyone attending. By the way, Helen, I assume you speak in Spanish, correct?
Sí, hablo español. ¿Estás grabando?
Claro.
You're still recording. ¿Estás grabando todavía?
Okay. I'm just curious, do you speak Portuguese by any chance?
No.
Fine. Curious.